You will need a back for your quilt, and the pattern does give 3 different options. One is to just have all one fabric and just put a seam in it. This was another one. This is just 12 fat quarters cut down to 18 by 20. Just realize that fat quarters are supposed to be 18 inches, so you may not have a lot to square it up to the 18. And with this configuration, you're a little bit tight for the quilter. Since I'm quilting my own, I'm okay with that. But most machine quilters want 3 to 4 inches all the way around the quilt. It's a little bit short on the top and bottom. Another option that the pattern had was to put a horizontal strip through the middle of the piece back, and that adds some length. You could also, if you were taking it to your quilter, just sew some scrap on the top or bottom and just tell them you don't want them to quilt in that part, but that does give them the space. The next thing we need to do with our quilt is bind it. The pattern calls for 3/8 of a yard of binding cut on the straight of grain, or 3/4 of a yard cut on the bias. But how do we know that's right? The pattern does not tell us, at least as far as I could find, how wide to cut the binding. We have lots of people that come into the store that want us to figure out how much binding they need, so I want to show you how to do that yourself. The finished size of the quilt should be 49.5 by 65. So, to figure out how many linear inches we need to figure out what the of the quilt is. So it's 49.5 plus 49.5 plus 65 plus 65 equals 229 inches. Or you could say 49.5 times 2 plus 65 times 2. Still equals 229 inches. Okay, so we know how many inches it is to go around the quilt. The next thing we need to do is to figure out how many strips of fabric we need to make that number of inches. So we're going to take 229 inches, divide that by the width of fabric, and when we're doing that, we usually figure there's about 40 inches of usable fabric across the width of the fabric, and that gives us about 5.75 strips. Well, you're not going to cut just 5 3/4 strips. You need enough to cut 6 strips. So if we cut 6 strips at 2 1/4 inches, that equals exactly 13.5 inches, which is 3/8 of a yard. Now when I'm getting fabric, I want enough to square my fabric up, so 3/8 of a yard is not enough in my opinion. I would recommend that if you're cutting this on the straight of grain, you get half a yard. You could still cut a bias binding from the 3/4 of a yard, no problem. Now, what if I don't want 2 1/4 inch wide binding? What if I want to cut it at 2 1/2? So 6 strips at 2 1/2 equals 15 inches. And the closest cut that we do at the store to 15 inches is a half a yard, which is 18 inches. So that would work for either. So I recommend you get a half a yard no matter which width of binding you're cutting. So I did get a half a yard, and I chose a fabric that has a diagonal stripe on it, so I get the look of a bias binding without actually having to do a bias binding. I did get the half a yard, so I have enough to square up my fabric. So I'm just going to trim a little bit off the edge so I have a nice straight edge, and I do have mine folded in fourths because it's easier to show that on the camera. And then I'm going to cut 2 1/4 inch strips. 2 1/4 times 2 is 4 1/2, so I'm just going to cut 2 strips at a time. 4 1/2, back off to the 2 1/4. Move those 2 out of the way. I'm going to move this forward so you can see it. I probably wouldn't be moving it around if I was just cutting and not having to deal with the camera. So again, 4 1/2, not 2 1/2, 4 1/2, back off to 2 1/4. And with a half a yard of fabric, if you happen to mess up on one strip, you do have enough, whether you're cutting at 2 1/4 or 2 1/2, to cut one more strip. So it's kind of an insurance policy. So again, 4 1/2, back it off to 2 1/4. And I have my 6 strips for my binding. When we go to sew our binding strips together, they get sewn on the diagonal. There's a couple reasons for that. One, the eye doesn't go immediately to a diagonal line like it does to a vertical or a horizontal. And also it distributes the extra bulk from the seam across a diagonal instead of piling all up on top itself. So I'm going to want my line to go from here to here, and honestly I don't usually mark because I can start at one point and watch to come to the other. But if you feel better marking, then all you're going to do is put your ruler down where it's matching inside one point and the other and mark. Now, that's actually the wrong way. So I would suggest that you check before you mark or start sewing to see which way. If I had marked that way, when I folded it, or when I opened it, it's actually going to be just piled on top of itself. So that does not help me. If I mark it this way, from this point to this point, when I open it, it continues on. And now I'm going to fuss with mine a little bit because I'm going to try to get my lines on my sort of stripe to match up fairly well. You don't necessarily have to do that. But if you do want to fuss with it and try to get it to match up, what I would suggest is that we fold where our mark would be on the piece that's on top. So I'm going to fold that, and then I can move this strip until it's sitting where I want it to be for the sewing. And I do want my edges to be lined up here on the top and the bottom. And that's not bad. I can go a little more. Remember, you only needed 5 3/4 strips, so you have a little bit of space to play. Well, that's not bad. I know it's not exact, but at least the stripes are going on the diagonal. So if you care about that, or you got a piece that it makes any difference, then that's how you can work on matching it. Okay, once you've sewn your strips together, and I do tend to chain piece, so I have a big wad, I'm going to clip them apart, and I usually just do this at the ironing board. I'm sort of matched there. Then I'm going to flip it over, and you can do this with a rotary cutter if you want, but I usually just do it while I'm standing at the ironing board pressing. We're going to trim this down to a 1/4 inch seam or thereabouts. And when we're pressing this, we're going to press this seam open. Again, that's because it spreads the bulk out, so when we're folding it over, we have less built up in one spot. So I'm going to press all those short seams open, and then the next thing I'm going to do is just stand there and press the whole strip wrong sides together along the lengthwise edge so that I get a double fold piece. Alright, there's lots of different ways to do binding. I'm going to show you the way I do it. If you'd like some machine methods, Marty has a couple on her website, 52quilts.com. You can fold your miters into your corners. I prefer to sew the miters into my corners because that's where I do all my joins too. If you ever enter a show quilt, whether you choose to fold in your miters or sew them in, judges always want them sewn shut. So if you fold it, then you need to whip stitch that fold. So the way I'm doing it, I need to start a 1/4 inch from the edge of my quilt. And I have already trimmed my extra backing and batting off on this quilt. If I'm doing a wider binding, sometimes I leave a little bit of batting sticking out beyond the quilt. I want my binding to be full. I don't want it to be flat when it's folded. So I'm going to mark on one end of the seam where I'm going to start sewing my 1/4 inch, and I'm going to mark it on the other end as well. And then I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to leave an inch at least hanging off the end, and I'm going to start sewing right there where that 1/4 inch starts. I will do a back stitch. You do want it to be right there at that 1/4 inch. When I get to the other end, I'm going to stop where I've marked my 1/4 inch, and again I'm going to do a back stitch to hold it. Okay, I've sewn my first strip on, and I can now cut that strip off, leaving about an inch or so, it can be more than that, hanging off the end. I mentioned that I like this method. One of the reasons I like this method is when I used the fold-in method, I inevitably got one of my joins in the corner, which made a huge amount of bulk. So with this, I can actually piece strips for each side of the quilt if I want to, and that would mean 4 strips. I didn't this time, but you could. Also, I mentioned letting the batting hang out beyond. The reason I sometimes do that with wider binding is because I always sew with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You could use a wider seam allowance. The reason I don't is if you have any piecing going out to the edge, you'll lose corners if you do wider than a 1/4 of an inch. So I cut off my one, and once again, I'm going to mark my 1/4 inch spot for the start and the stop. And this really should just line up with the one that I've already sewn with that seam. When I get ready to sew, I'm going to fold this out of the way. I'm going to put my next piece on top of it, like this. Again, it's hanging off the edge. I'm going to start sewing right here at this 1/4 of an inch. I do not want to catch this piece in it, so it's important to start and stop in the same place. But I do want them to run up and touch each other. So I'm going to start sewing at my 1/4 inch. I will also mark my 1/4 inch on the other end to stop. So I'm not going off the edge. I'm starting at that 1/4 of an inch and ending at that 1/4 of an inch. I've sewn all 4 sides, just starting and stopping the 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now the next thing I'm going to do is fold 2 edges on top of each other, so at the corners. And then I'm just going to pin those together so my folded edges are together and my raw edges on the other side are together. Now you're going to need some sort of marking pencil that you can see. I've put a little dot right here where my stitching ends. I have 2 different ways that you can mark. One is just with a square ruler. So I'm going to mark the line even with where the end of my start and stop is on my corner. And then I can divide. I'm going to take the seam allowance out. So I'm going to measure from the seam allowance to the edge, and I have about 7/8 of an inch. 7/8 of an inch is a little less than 1/2 an inch, half of it. So I'm just lining that up. Actually, you're going to want to line your straight line up with that line you just made. And I'm going to mark a vertical line where that 1/2 an inch, where the center is. I don't know whether you're seeing it or not on camera. And then I can just take any square ruler because they have the diagonal line through them. And I'm going to line my point up with that vertical line I drew. I want to have where I drew my horizontal line right there, the edge of it. And I'm going to draw basically the top of a house here. So once I have it drawn, I'm going to sew on that line that I marked, not the other 2. I'm going to start stitching right here at the corner, and I will need to back stitch. I'll do a couple stitches. I'm going to come up here just before I hit the point. I'm going to pivot and take 1 stitch straight across, then pivot again and come down to my folded edge, again back stitch. The 1 stitch across the top gives space to fold my corner in. So again, I'm stitching from here to here to here, back stitching at the start and the stop, and doing 1 straight stitch across the point at the top. Okay, I really don't know whether you can see the marks or not, but I have stitched it just like I said I was going to. And before I trim my extra seam allowance off, I want to open it up and check to be sure I have a nice square corner here. I don't want to trim my extra seam allowance off until I've checked. When you're happy with it, then we're going to trim the extra off, and I know it's hard to see because I am using black thread so that it matches my. So I cut straight across, leaving just a little bit up above my point, and then I'm going to trim off my corners. And then open that up, and flip it right side out. So there's my mitered corner just sewn in, and you can use a point turner to finish turning that right side out. If you like collecting tools like I do, there is a tool called the binding miter tool, and it will actually do 90 degree, 120, and 135 degree angles. I've pinned it just like I did on my previous step, and because my thread matches so well, again, I have marked where the edge of that is, and I've pinned exactly like I did the last time so that my two layers are on top of each other, my folded edges are matching, and my raw edges are matching. And with this, I'm doing a 90 degree angle, so I'm going to use the corner that says 90 degrees. I can just put that on there and line it up, and you really want to keep it straight up and down, so you could mark a vertical line if you want to, but it's just to mark that corner, so your square ruler will work just as well. And I'm hoping you can see that, but there's a mark here, and again I'm just going to sew on that mark, and other than that it's exactly the same as my last corner. Once you've sewn all your corners in, then it's just a matter of turning your binding to the wrong side, and I do match up my folded edge with my seam on the back side. And then these binding clips are nice to have. You do not need enough to go all the way around the quilt. I can just clip it in place, and then as I stitch, because I'm going to stitch this down by hand, whip stitch it, just going to clip it, and it's going to hold it till I stitch right up to it. Then I can unclip that one and move it on further down the line for where I'm stitching. So it's just a matter of whip stitching it to the back side by hand. Let's talk a little bit about labeling. Quilt historians, appraisers, purists will tell you you need to label every quilt, at least with who, what, when, and where. So now I'm going to tick all those people off and say I don't label all my quilts. I quilt because I enjoy the process. I don't really care whether future generations know that I made it or not. I have two boys, and when I'm gone, I doubt they're going to give a rip about most of my quilts. That said, if I'm going to label a quilt, I'm usually going to have fun with it. If you're going to enter a quilt in any show or anything like that, you will have to have a label on it. So this one I did on my embroidery machine. It is recommended that you name your quilts. I honestly hate naming inanimate objects. It was hard enough to name my children, who are animate. So a lot of times I will use the pattern name. And so the pattern that we've been working on all year is ABC Quilt With Me. You should put your name on it, when you made it, and where you made it. It's also not a bad idea, especially if you're entering in a show, to put the designer's name for the pattern or the source for the pattern, and you may be required to do that for some in shows. And then I just went ahead, because we did the ABCs, I put all the block names on the back of mine and the letters of the alphabet. So I did label this one, give myself a pat on the back. Let's look at some more, just for options. So this one was on the embroidery machine. This one, and you may not be able to read it even, which is okay. I had to give it a name, and I had to put my complete address on it because I was mailing it off. It was photographed for a book, and the center of it is kind of just in front of it is some wild flying geese. It goes in an offset circle. It doesn't even complete the circle. So I named it You're Not the Center of the Universe, because I was a little upset with some people at that point in time, not anybody having to do with the quilt. It has name, address, and when I made it. And this is about as simple as you can get. This is just a piece of white fabric, and I wrote on it with a Pigma pen. These are some I made a long time ago. If I'm going to label a quilt, I'm going to have fun with it. So this pelican, what do they eat? They eat fish. So I cut out a fish out of a print fabric, and it's made by me and where we were living at the time and when I made it. This one, the chicken, I did an egg for my label. Again, it has my name, where it was made, and when. I did not name the quilt. This one is Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, where we used to go when we lived on the East Coast for vacations. And it was made for my husband to hang in his office. I didn't say where it was made, but I did a sand dollar for the label. So I cut out the shape and appliqued it down. It was made by me for my husband, Christmas 1998. And again, that was just a Pigma pen. Then, if you have an embroidery machine, you can have some fun with that. The front of this is a moose head. So I found a moose embroidery, and the name of the pattern was Moose on the Loose. I did not come up with it. And it took me 5 years to get this finished. That doesn't mean it really took me that long to piece it. It means it sat around and waited to be quilted and bound. This is last year's First Thursday Mystery, and we had there was enough fabric last year to make all these extra fan blades. There are fans on the front of this quilt. I'm not going to worry about it, or the blades at least. So I just put them all together, and then I did a circle and wrote on it with a Pigma pen again. The name of the quilt, again, is the pattern name by the designer. It was made by me, Colorado Springs, 2014-15. This one, the front of it is all different fruits hand appliqued, and I spent months appliquing those. I did pre-wash all the fabric. I had to mark this quilt to quilt it, and then when I went and washed the markings out, some of the fabric ran even after pre-washing it. So I was ready to throw it in the trash. I got most of the marks out through a multitude of processes. So it became Fruit Basket Upset because I was so upset with the quilt by the time I was finished with it. I did name that one. And the front of this quilt is all different houses. And I personalized it a lot with names, addresses in the quilting. So, and then in the border I quilted different home and house sayings. So this one is There's No Place Like Home, and it has my name, where it was made, and when it was made. So if you're going to label, then by all means have fun with it. You'll notice I bordered this one. I bordered the one for this year's. It isn't a bad idea to label them. It's kind of nice to go back and see when you made them. I almost finished my video for the year without a picture of the finished quilt. So here's the finished quilt. It's bound, labeled, and ready to go to the store tomorrow. When I quilted it, I chose to do an all-over pattern. I used clamshells, which are fairly traditional. I thought this quilt was busy enough that if I had done custom quilting, it would have been more distracting than adding to it. But that's just my opinion. If you quilt it yourself, you could certainly do cross-hatching. That's an easy thing to do on your domestic machine. If you go find painter's tape, the width that you would like your crosshatches to be, you can tape it and then sew along the painter's tape, and then you could use the guide that comes with most sewing machines to sew rows next to that. So it could be on the diagonal, it could be vertical. You can hire someone to quilt it for you. You could stitch in the ditch. It's whatever you want to do, it's your quilt. I hope you've had fun with this year. And if you have, I would encourage you to sign up again for next year's mystery.